get them to come. They wouldn't come for me.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see a lot of new faces and a lot of old faces. But thank you all for coming along. We're delighted to welcome Anne Sebba again for the second time recently to Wimbledon Synagogue, this time as an interviewee rather than as an interviewer when she was last here. Anne's journalistic career began at Reuters in the early 70s when she told me she was actually fired for getting pregnant because they didn't feel it was appropriate for a mother to be a foreign correspondent. She then began her career as an acclaimed biographer, specializing in historical women, including Wallis Simpson, Jenny Churchill, Mother Teresa, and Laura Ashley. You'll also have seen her in many TV documentaries, particularly about the royal family, the latest of which was Channel 5's Princess Michael of Kent, and her recent Zoomed interview comparing Meghan Markle with Princess Diana. She's had a close involvement with a number of literary societies, including the Society of Authors and the National Archives Trust, and charities, particularly PEN, which promotes freedom of expression on behalf of writers who are sometimes killed for their views. As you know, Anne is here to talk about her latest biography of Ethel Rosenberg, set during the paranoid anti-communist Cold War in the post-World War II period in the US. Anne's sympathies, as you'll hear, are very much with her subject, but you'll no doubt make up your own minds as to her guilt when we hope you'll read the book yourself. Our Wimbledon member Lawrence, Sir Lawrence Freedman, who you'll see shortly, could not be here, but he'll be streaming with Anne to discuss the book after her presentation. Lawrence has been described as the Dean of British Strategic Studies, an author of numerous books on 20th century warfare, including the Cold War. He's Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, author of the official history of the Falklands War, and a member of the Chilcot Iraq Inquiry. Both Anne and Lawrence have contributed many articles over the years to periodicals and newspapers. We'll begin tonight with Anne giving her presentation, during which those on YouTube will only hear her voice, over which will be followed by her conversation with Lawrence. All those watching on YouTube, please contribute your comments or questions at any time, which I'll pick up on with questions in the room. Anne.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a triumph of technology to get this working. I shouldn't say that in advance. It's tempting fate, isn't it? So let's hope that we have all these different elements working together. I like to use pictures to tell this story for a number of reasons, as you'll see. I'm just going to set the scene for a short presentation, and then we'll discuss the issues in greater detail. But I like to start at the end, and it would help if I had a laser pointer that actually works, but I think it's not going to. Ricky, there. Okay, now I've gone too far, but that's all right. I'll stick with this and hope that it's got some momentum and it'll work at this point. Oh, I've got to stay in front of this as well, so I can't move. That's the problem, getting the range and the microphone. So the reason that I wanted to write this story 70 years after Ethel's death is not because 70 is a magic word, even though oh, you think it won't move? Okay. Well, I will say next slide, please, if I can't get it to move. So as I was saying, the reason for writing this book now is because 70 years, publishers sometimes think that there's some magic in a peg, and it's not that. There are two very good reasons. First of all, there might still be people alive, and indeed Ethel's two sons in their late 70s are alive. So that was important. I also met Ethel's social worker, someone who was in prison with Ethel as well. But also I had hoped that 70 years would give some perspective, that the dust would have settled a bit and people could examine this very provocative story with some calmness. That actually hasn't happened. I realize the Rosenberg story is an absolute touchstone for a divided America, which still divides on this story along political lines. So the other reason for wanting to tell the story now is because I wanted to extrapolate Ethel's story from Julius's. I found if people knew anything about this, they always referred to, oh, the Rosenbergs, those spies, as if they were one indissoluble unit. And I believed it was very important to look at Ethel on her own, however much she was loyal to and loved her husband, Julius. His story is much more straightforward, as you will see. So this is a picture of her two sons, who were 10 and 6 when they were orphaned and their parents were killed, Michael and Robbie. And Michael and Robbie, as you see there, had to learn about their parents' death from the television. And I'm going to play you a clip in a minute of the veteran US reporter, Bob Considine. He was really the Walter Cronkite of his day, who was one of those reporters who had to watch the electrocution and who reported on it afterwards. And if you listen to what he says, you will understand many of the toxic elements that went into this stew of misogyny, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism. And it's definitely present in what he says. So just take a listen to Bob Considine.
She died a lot harder. When it appeared that she had received enough electricity to kill an ordinary person and had received the exact amount that had killed her husband, the doctors went over and pulled down the cheap prison dress, a little dark green printed job, and placed the placed the stethoscopes to her, and then looked around and looked at each other rather dumbfounded and seemed surprised that she was not dead. Believing she was dead, the attendants had taken off the ghastly strappings and electrodes and black belts and so forth. And these had to be readjusted again, and she was given more electricity, which started again kind of a ghastly plume of smoke that rose from her head and went up against the skylight overhead. After two more of those jolts, Ethel Rosenberg had met a maker, and she'll have a lot of explaining to do too.
So the reason for playing that to you is not just because it's so gruesome and you hear the barbaric details of Ethel's botched killing, but it's because Bob Considine, who was a really good man, you can see how he was suffering. He couldn't even say the word stethoscope, but he had somehow swallowed the prevailing misogyny of the day. He said that the 3 jolts which killed Julius, and there's a whole story about which one the needed to kill first. Perhaps I'll come back to that in questions. But the 3 jolts which had killed Julius would have been enough to kill an ordinary person. So that was the government FBI narrative that they had to create, that Ethel was so wicked she was not an ordinary person. And they did that in all sorts of ways. The other small element is that he refers to her dress, a cheap dark green prison job. There is no reference to what Julius was wearing. So that's the misogyny of the day. And it's important to start with her death because that's, for some people, all they know. Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, for example, the opening lines are, "It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs." But let's go back to the beginning now and look at the house where Ethel was born, if you can come up with the next slide. She was born on the Lower East Side, and the shop window that you see, 64 Sheriff Street, her father, Barney, by all accounts, a sweet, gentle, ineffectual man, had a machine repair shop there. And both her parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, Yiddish speakers, illiterate in English. So Ethel was a translator for them both. They never had much money. There was no loo, no inside loo. Ethel had no window until she was given her own bedroom later on in her adolescence. So here is her mother, Tessie, and Tessie was really the cause of much unhappiness for Ethel. Ethel was not cherished, Ethel was not valued, a girl was not valued. So the problem was that Ethel was a very bright child. She skipped a year at school, but Tessie didn't see any value in education for girls. She had 3 sons. The youngest son, David, born after a 7-year gap and a couple of miscarriages, was the child on whom all love and affection was lavished. David was not very clever, but Ethel too loved David. He was curly-haired and, rosy-cheeked. But Ethel was the one who really was expected to look after him and read to him. Ethel went to school when she was about 11. I mean, she went to public school, Seward Park High, and it was this school that really opened Ethel's eyes to the possibility of the American dream. She was quite a shy child, but she loved acting and music and singing. And this is Seward Park High School, where I went, and you can see the assembly hall and the stage. And just to give you an idea, Walter Matthau went to this school, and Zero Mostel. So, it offered the possibility of transformation to a better life. And Ethel hoped for a better life. Having skipped a class, she really hoped that she could go to college and wouldn't have to go to secretarial school. This is the entrance to the school, and you can just see how it must have opened another world for her. All the children had to graduate in swimming because, of course, it was considered a basic piece of knowledge and safety, and they couldn't leave until they were able to swim. And the Olympic-sized swimming pool was matched only by the Olympic-sized library. So this really opened Ethel's eyes, but when she graduated in 1931, aged 15, it was the height of the Depression, and even though college for women was just something that was starting and some of her friends were going there, she had to do the secretarial course and get a job and give most of her wages to her family because there was still David to educate. I tried to get hold of the class yearbook because all American schools make a big deal of their yearbook, and you can just see Ethel there. And of course, because when Ethel was arrested, anyone who knew her or who had any connection with her immediately destroyed all the photographs and all evidence that they had ever known Ethel. So Seward Park said to me they were terribly sorry, but it was the one year, 1931, they didn't have a yearbook. And I was devastated, but I had a very helpful researcher in New York. It was the height of lockdown, and she went through every single class member that Ethel was at school with and found the children of one in California who said, yes, their mother had sung in duets with Ethel, and they were very supportive, and they had one. But it was COVID, so they couldn't go to a photocopier, and it was too precious. And anyway, long story, but as you see, I have managed to find Ethel's yearbook, and the school has now digitized a copy, so they now have a complete set again. But that's really to give you an insight into the atmosphere of the time, how merely knowing the Rosenbergs was something that you had to be frightened of. And it's also to give you an insight into the importance of photographs, because when Ethel and Julius were arrested, the FBI took all the letters, images, what little sticks of furniture they had. So the two boys grew up without any images of them with their parents, and I can only imagine how unbelievably difficult that is, not to have any memory or pictures of your parents. So these pictures that I'm going to show you the next series are pictures that friends of the two sons have sent them subsequently. So even though Ethel got a job with a packing company, she had two key things that marked her adolescence. She continued to go. She won a sort of scholarship to a settlement house acting school, and here she is in Amdram. Who knows whether she was any good, but she loved it. And she met some like-minded people who opened her eyes to the world scenario. But the two aspects that marked her adolescence, one was she was absolutely determined to sing. So she went for an audition at Carnegie Hall. She wasn't satisfied with any old choir on the Lower East Side. She applied to something called the Schola Cantorum, which was absolutely top-notch. It had Toscanini and Klemperer and many Eastern European emigres who came to conduct it. They sang Russian music, which was really avant-garde at the time. But Ethel was turned down on her first audition, and instead of just going home and saying, well, I'm obviously not good enough, because she couldn't sight sing, she was able to get very cheaply a piano. This was the height of the Depression, and people were throwing out pianos because they took up room that could be used to take in an extra lodger. So Ethel was lucky to pick up a piano cheaply. She taught herself sight singing, went back for a second audition and was accepted. And she was the youngest singer at Schola Cantorum, where she stayed for a year. She was still a teenager, just 19, but after a year they went on tour, so she had to leave because she couldn't afford to go on tour. I think that's an insight into her determination. The other thing is that while she was working at the packing company, there was a strike for union recognition and better terms and conditions. And she took a lead in this strike, lying down in the road on her raincoat to stop the lorries coming in. Her pay was docked for 6 months, but afterwards, the newly established National Labour Relations Board found in her favour that she was justified in striking for better conditions, and she had all her back pay restored. And the woman I met in prison told me that that single event was what made her realise that individuals can make a difference if they really stick to their views. So she joined the Communist Party in 1936, a time when many people joined the Communist Party. I think her communism was twofold. One, idealistic. She saw a lot of poverty on the Lower East Side. And the other aspect was geopolitical. How else could you stop the rising totalitarian dictatorships of Hitler and Mussolini? Certainly 1936 was a key year because Hitler marched into the Rhineland, breaking the treaty obligations. Nobody stopped him. And many of Ethel's friends went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. The French had a Popular Front government with a communist in it. Many Lower East Side Jews, perhaps with Russian relations, remembering communism and Bolshevism had started there. She was at home in the Communist Party in 1936. She began singing for a number of organizations and fundraising outlets that were raising money, many of them for the Spanish Civil War. And on one of these occasions, for some reason, she was nervous. She had a favorite song that she always sang, Chiri Biri Bin, but it was on one of these occasions. This is a bit loud. This is not Ethel, it's Jack. Is it too loud? Turn it down. Okay, we don't need to hear Chiri Biri Bin. But that was her favorite song, and she was singing it on the night that she met Julius. So they met in 1936 because he calmed her nerves. And trying to move on. Okay, so this, these are all photographs that have been sent to the boys subsequently. And for me, it's important because what I'm trying to do in this book is to restore the humanity to a woman who's had her voice brutally denied, not to relitigate the trial, although that's important, but singing was something, and music was something that was absolutely key to Ethel's whole being. So being a communist in 1939 was uncomfortable because World War II started, but it started with the Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Hitler made a pact with Russia. So many people left the Communist Party. Ethel and Julius didn't. It was more comfortable to stay in the Communist Party by 1941, when America joined in the war after Pearl Harbor. And by that point, Hitler had marched into Russia. So suddenly, at that point, America had done this yo-yoing with whether Russia was an enemy or an ally. But by 1941, it was very definitely an ally. It was a brave ally. They were taking the brunt of the fighting. And there were many rallies and films in America at that point because the government realized it had a lot of work to do to educate its citizens. Look, I know we told you the Russians are terrible and communism's a ghastly system, but actually they're now our allies and we should support them. So it was at one of these rallies that Julius made himself known to a Russian diplomat, a Russian, saying, I've got a degree in engineering from City College. I've got many friends who are working for government departments. I want to help the Russians. I think as they're our allies, they should have all the information I can get my hands on. So that's how Julius became a aspiring recruiter. He wasn't called up for service because he had poor eyesight and asthma. And during the war, their first son, Michael, was born in 1943. Ethel had worked in a voluntary capacity for the Defense Council. But I think if I could have only one picture in the book, it would very definitely be this, because part of the misinformation campaign that was put forward was that Ethel was a terrible mother. Ethel was a wicked mother. Ethel was so wicked because she put communism above her children that she was almost responsible for all the deaths in the Korean War. And I think it's important actually to look at what a good mother Ethel was, how mothering was very definitely her focus by this point, and she was determined to be a better mother than her own mother, Tessie Greenglass. She identified very much with the Rosenberg side of the family that was aspirational. The Rosenbergs believed in better education. These books were suddenly coming on the market. Suddenly, mothering was a discoverable science. It was very new. And Ethel not only had a subscription to Parents magazine and followed it religiously, she actually went to mothering classes, and this is typical of her. You know, not just any mothering classes, but she found Edith Buxbaum, who was a Viennese émigré, who was very avant-garde, who believed that children, it was their democratic right to be the equals of their parents, and therefore you get on the floor to play with them, and your children call you by your first name. And, you know, Ethel was determined to follow all of this. I don't think she was a natural mother, but she was desperate to be the best mother she could. She believed in the discoverability of all things. Her brother, David, who was 7 years younger, and this is probably the only picture of the two of them together outside the repair shop on Sheriff Street, was remarkably, I say remarkably because it's obviously a lapse in American security, he was not sent with his platoon to Europe. He was sent to Los Alamos, which is where the Manhattan Project was in New Mexico, the Manhattan Project for America to build atomic weapons. And he was sent there as a lowly machinist. He'd failed most of his exams. And it was known that he was a very avid communist and Marxist, much more so than Ethel and Julius. I know this for two reasons. First of all, their letters, which were also confiscated by the FBI, are in Boston University. And David and his wife, Ruth, who you see here, wrote to each other saying they hoped when they had children they'd be born with all the love of Marx and the strength of Lenin, and they'd live in a world that was free of materialism. He was so well known for his communism that other people in Los Alamos asked if they could have their bunks removed to a different dormitory because they couldn't stand hearing David go on the whole time about how wonderful communism was. Ben Baderson, one of the known atomic scientists, has written about him. But it's thanks to David that the whole story unraveled, and they were arrested, Julius first in 1950. It unraveled because the Americans had access to some secret information that they were busy deciphering or decrypting. These documents were the secret cables between Russian agents, Russian agents in New York to their masters in Moscow. They've been called by history the Venona documents. So these Venona documents led to the arrest of Klaus Fuchs, who was a real serious atomic scientist who had been living in England. He was from Eastern Europe, but the British sent him to Los Alamos. He was arrested in Cambridge in 1950, and he had sent important information to the Soviets, which he admitted immediately. It's important to contrast his treatment by the British with the subsequent treatment in America of these two. So Klaus Fuchs confessed and named names. He was given the maximum term in Britain for an espionage-related crime, 14 years, of which he served about 10. But the British, in their typical way, were rather embarrassed by all of this. How could we have been responsible for sending a scientist to Los Alamos who spilled all the beans? So there wasn't a big fuss about it. It was kept as quiet as possible. He named names. He named his courier in Albuquerque, that's also near Los Alamos. His courier was a man called Harry Gold, who was already in prison. Harry Gold immediately named David and Ruth Greenglass. David named, and this is the important part, only one person. He named Julius. He did not name Ethel. And if you read David's grand jury statement, which was only available in 2015 after he died, the grand jury statement is where you have to, where you're tried to see if there is a case. And David said, no, my sister had nothing to do with this. Leave my sister out of it, not just because she's my sister. No, it's just Julius. However, because of this secret information, Venona, the American authorities knew that Julius, who was codenamed Antenna or Liberal, was a aspiring recruiter. So they knew he had lots of names to give if he would only spill the beans. But Julius refused to name any names. So they thought, how are we going to put pressure on him? And they arrested Ethel 3 weeks later. They always knew that the information against Ethel was shaky at best or weak, but they thought if we arrest her too and threaten her with a death penalty, what mother wouldn't talk? Of course they'll talk, they'll name names. So that's why both Ethel and Julius were arrested in 1950. And here's the difference with the Brits. The Americans wanted to make a huge production of this, that we arrest all commie spies, and I'll talk about why there was this credible threat in America. So they wanted as much publicity as possible, and even though they knew that the case against Ethel was weak, they charged them both with conspiracy to commit espionage. Conspiracy is almost impossible to disprove. Of course, Ethel and Julius had a conversation. It's the espionage I take issue with. And by the way, I don't use words like guilty and innocent because I think it's a much more nuanced story. However, Ethel was arrested and her sons, of course, had to go into care because she hadn't had time to make arrangements for them. This photograph was the last time Ethel and Julius were allowed to touch, let alone embrace, because the authorities did not want the sort of sympathy that a picture like this would generate. So ultimately, Ethel was imprisoned for 3 years, and when she was in solitary confinement, Julius was brought to her in a cage to sit outside her own cell for once a week. So they had very little opportunity to plan or talk about anything. Julius had an informer in his cell, a man called Eugene Tartikoff. Possibly Ethel did as well. So how was she convicted? Because there needed to be an overt act, and there were multiple miscarriages of justice in their trial. But the main miscarriage of justice was the perjury that Ethel's brother David committed, because David did a plea bargain in order that he hoped he wouldn't serve a sentence at all. And actually his wife, who it was known was a spy and was passing on information, was never indicted. She stayed behind to look after the children. So I'm sure you've recognized one man. Oh, whoops, yes, you've recognized him. I didn't know how to get this to work. So Trump, of course, but Roy Cohn on the right, the man with a scar down his nose. The reason he has a scar down his nose is because when he was a young man, his mother decided that his nose wasn't quite perfect, as everything else about him was. So she gave him a very botched nose job, and he had a scar down his nose for the rest of his life. But when he was 23 and a young, brash, on-the-make Jewish lawyer, he was determined to make his name in this case. And he did a plea bargain with David. He persuaded David to lie, to say that he had seen his sister type. He afterwards went on to work for McCarthy and later on advised Trump, which is why I've got this picture, because in the final years of Trump's presidency, you may have heard him say when he was desperate, "Where is my Roy Cohn?" But Roy Cohn was long since dead. So the perjury that David committed was to say that he had seen his sister Ethel type up notes on her Remington typewriter. The typewriter was terribly important in the case because typing was something that all women did. So in the 1950s, it represented something that the men would feel, oh, well, my wife or my sister or my secretary, you know, they all type. What if I can't trust any of them? So somehow Ethel came to represent an aspect of American womanhood that was transgressive, and she had to be stopped, because if you can't trust someone to do the typing, who can you trust? The lawyer, Irving Kaufman, was also a very young man. He'd only been a senior judge for 2 years, but he too was desperate to get this case as the judge. The Jewish community was divided. I'm sure we'll talk more about anti-Semitism, but these two, Kaufman and Cohn, wanted to prove themselves as good Jews, establishment Jews, completely distancing themselves from the impoverished Lower East Side red commie Jews who they wanted to show were a danger to their country. The other aspect of the trial that was completely invented, it was full of these stage props, was the idea that Julius had introduced this jello box. You can see at the bottom the torn bit, which is the recognition signal. It was torn asymmetrically, and that, you know, the real thing, had it ever existed, would have long since gone to Moscow. So Roy Cohn made a huge production of cutting a jello box several times. The jello box is important because every American housewife would have a box of jello in her kitchen. So here again is Ethel, the American housewife who's meant to stay at home and buy fridges and cook for her family, is somehow distorting what it means to be an American wife and mother. And this is how art, the tea towel on the right is a piece of art and collage that's been made subsequently using the letter that President Eisenhower sent denying clemency a few days before they were killed, saying, I know it goes against the grain to kill a mother of children, but in this case, and his son was fighting in Korea, in this case, it has to be done because she is the leader. Why did he say she is the leader? Because she was 2.5 years older than Julius. That was the only evidence that could be produced that Ethel was the master and Julius the slave. It was a sort of mangled Nietzschean philosophy of master and slave that somehow became the idea that they were using to persuade people that Ethel was really the ringleader, not Julius, but there was no factual evidence for that. So this is Ethel on her way to Sing Sing, an isolation prison, after she's been found guilty. She's leaving the Women's House of Detention. And the reason I want to include that is because there are almost no photographs of Ethel smiling. The jury, by the way, was not sequestered, so they were able to read all the newspapers which described Ethel as dumpy and unfashionable. Well, of course she was. She was in prison. She had no money for clothes. She decided to wear what the other prisoners donated her or made for her if they crocheted her a hat. But here's a rare photograph of her smiling, which I just think is important in restoring the humanity. And probably I should finish there. She wrote extraordinary letters to her sons and her husband while she was in prison. And I'm just going to read you this because I realize you can't actually read it from that. But I think the focus of her life was always on what sort of life she could help create for her sons if she wasn't there to orchestrate it. She was never the optimist in the way that Julius was. And here's what she wrote. My dearest darlings, this is the process known as sweating it out, and it's tough, that's for sure. At the same time, we can't let a lot of chickens that go about their business without panic, even when something's frightening them. We can't let them put us to shame, can we? Maybe you thought that I didn't feel like crying too when we were hugging and kissing goodbye, huh? Even though I'm slightly older than 10. Darlings, that would have been so easy, far too easy on myself, and I had to resist a very real temptation to follow your lead and break down with you, because I love you more than myself, and because I know you needed that love far more than I needed the relief of crying. There's just one thing I want to say before I hand over to Lawrence to put me through my paces, and that is, I usually say if this book is about one thing, it's about the importance of the rule of law. But actually, if this book is about one thing, it's about the importance of family. And we start off with a dystopian family, not dystopian, dysfunctional family. The Greenglasses really Tessie Greenglass was the mother from hell, but it ends with a redemptive family, the Mirapols. And I just want to show you the two, the parents, the adoptive parents that Robbie and Michael found. That's Anne Mirapol, who was a teacher, and Abel Mirapol, who was a songwriter. If you know the song Strange Fruit, he wrote the lyrics for that, and they mostly lived off the royalties from Strange Fruit while they were with them. And the balance of discipline and love and respecting their birth parents while not martyrizing them was really what marked their adolescence, because the New York State tried very hard to institutionalize the two boys, and the Mirapols had to fight very hard. There is lots more I could say, but I'm actually going to finish there. So I hope you've all got some questions. So I need to sit down, I think.
Right. Over to you, Lawrence. Can you hear us, Lawrence? I think, can you hear us, Lawrence? You're muted, Lawrence, at the moment. Am I?
Yes. Now you're free. You're up.
With you, Lawrence.
Hi. So sorry I'm not actually in the room with you. I want to say a couple of things and a couple of questions to Anne. The first thing is, sorry, am I coming through all right?
Yes.
Okay. The first thing is, it's a splendid book. I mean, it's worth reading. I think you've had a really good taste there of the way in which a life that is viewed through one perspective can be seen and humanity restored. We can understand the personalities. We see the mother, the wife, the daughter-in-law, and all of those other aspects. My wife says I'm echoing and you need to turn something off, but I'll persevere. I can't. You can try and sort that out. Let me talk about how I have a different perspective and sense of the way that I approach these issues. My background is a historian of the Cold War, and this obviously is quite an important case in the Cold War. It's also a wider case in 20th century history, because again, as we can see in the book, the story doesn't come about because of the Manhattan Project or because of McCarthyism. It starts with the rise of the Communist Party as a serious political force in the West after the Bolshevik Revolution, and the role of Jews in that. And obviously, in this story, the anti-Semitism and the divisions within the Jewish community itself are really quite important. It is often a Jewish story. Often it's a Jewish story. With the Communist Party, obviously Lenin and Stalin weren't Jewish, Marx was, Trotsky was, part of the divisions within the Communist Party. One of the more important but forgotten bits of post-First World War communism was in Hungary, where Bela Kun led a rebellion and for a brief period was in charge in 1919 and was then overthrown. Had enormous implications, that, because it underscored the relationship of Jews and Bolshevism, and led to and was one of the reasons why a lot of the scientists who became so involved in the atomic weapons program, many of whom came from Hungary, fled from Hungary in the first place. So there's all sorts of interlocking areas through this story in which Jews are playing a very prominent role on both sides. Again, as the book makes clear, in the trial of the Rosenbergs, there were Jews prosecuting, judging, as well as defending. In the Manhattan Project, the leader was Robert Oppenheimer, as many of you have heard. His opponent within the, not so much, well, within the Manhattan Project itself, it became more important later because he wanted to go much more aggressively in developing nuclear technology, was Edward Teller, another Jew from Hungary. So all the way through, you've got these divisions. And I think, as comes out in the book, the one of the reasons why the Rosenbergs were caught up as they were in the tensions of the time was the desire of many leading Jews to isolate themselves from the taint of communism at a time when Stalin's Russia was being seen as the great threat, and McCarthyism was moving. That's an important part of the context. And within this, the Rosenbergs had made their choices. Now, the difficulty in this story, I think, is that there's no doubt that at the end, something unjust and terrible happened. It's clear from the book and from all other accounts that the original intention was to coerce Ethel and through her Julius. The aim wasn't to end with an execution, but they set themselves off on that course on the assumption that this would cause one of them to break and spill the beans on others, and it didn't happen. As mentioned, Fuchs was sentenced to 14 years, 10. Greenglass and Morton Sobel, who was part of the same ring, lived to tell the tale. So the fact that it ended up this way clouds everything that happened. Where I think I don't quite share the same approach as Anne is, and she doesn't want to use the words guilty, but there was a guilty verdict against Ethel, is that I think the evidence is now pretty strong that she was part of the spy ring, that she did know what was going on. And I think one of the difficulties anybody has with this case is the Rosenbergs became a cause célèbre because it seemed to be, and in many ways was, a miscarriage of justice in the way that the prosecution was handled and so on. You want then to believe that there's a total miscarriage of justice. And of course, the sons carried this flame for a long time that held, as both of their parents had held during the trial, that they were innocent. It was only, it wasn't so much the Venona papers, which mentioned that led them to change their mind, but the fact that Morton Sobel, who was sentenced at the same time, admitted that he was part of the spy ring. And at that point, they decided they had to accept that too. Now, it's obviously the case that Ethel didn't play the same sort of role as her husband, but there is an important source that Anne will be surprised by this because it's been mentioned in other reviews, but I'll mention it now, which is a series of documents that came out in 2009 from a chap called Alexander Vasiliev, who was a former Soviet KGB officer, and he transcribed Soviet espionage records from the 30s and 40s. These became available in notebooks. They're widely available, and they do mention Ethel as part of the ring. They underscore also the importance of what Julius did. They mention another spy, Russell McNutt, who they say that was recruited by the Rosenbergs, and I think it seems to me unlikely that someone as close to her husband, who shared the same beliefs, who would not have thought that there was anything particularly surprising or wrong about getting material to the glorious Soviet allies during the Second World War, why she would have been kept out of it, why she would have stayed clear. So this perhaps is a point where I can stop and hand back to Anne, and we can talk a bit more about it. But I think that would be my main observation, is that I don't think it detracts from the tragedy of the case or the humanity of Ethel, or an understanding of how she got to the position she got to know that she probably was involved in spying for the Soviet Union. And one has to remember that the stuff that was handed over by Julius wasn't trivial. It's stuff that mattered. It did make a difference. And you can take a view about the Cold War and how this should be understood. But he was a spy, and it's probably the case that Anne was one as well. So I'll stop there, and then we can. Anne will no doubt want to riposte.
And Laura Ashley. You'll also have seen her in many TV documentaries, particularly about the royal family, the latest of which was Channel 5's Princess Michael of Kent, and her recent Zoomed interview comparing Meghan Markle with Princess Diana.
What should I do?
She's had a close involvement with a number of literary societies, including the Society of Authors and the National Archives Trust, and charities, particularly PEN, which promotes freedom of expression on behalf of writers who are sometimes killed for their views. As you know, Anne is here to talk about her latest biography, Ethel Rosenberg, set during the paranoid anti-communist Cold War in the post-World War II period in the U.S. Anne's sympathies, as you'll hear, are very much with her subject, but you'll no doubt make up your own minds as to her guilt when we hope you'll read the book yourself.
Okay.
Wimbledon member Sir Lawrence Freedman, who you'll see shortly, could not be here.
Assassination.
With a subject, but you'll no doubt make up your own minds.
My main observation.
Okay.
Wimbledon member Sir Lawrence Freedman, who you'll see shortly, could not be here.
Shall I answer him or not? I can't. Okay. Okay, so it's over to me, is it, to answer all of that? I'm sorry if Lawrence can't hear. So the reason for concentrating on Venona is because Venona was what was used at the time, and Venona is first-hand the documents that were sent from Russian spies, Russian agents, to their handlers in Moscow. The KGB, therefore, because you see their views in that, they did not think that Ethel was a spy. They say there are 3,000 of these documents that were transcribed, of which 19 mention the Rosenbergs at all, and 3 refer in some way to Julius's wife, and only 1 to Ethel by her own name. So the KGB did not give Ethel a code name. They did not think she was a spy. And in case that wasn't crystal clear, the 2 men decoding, Gardner and Lamfair, actually added a memo saying does not work means, because that was in the cable, that Ethel does not work means she does not work as a spy. It does not mean the earning of a daily living. So that's the first thing. That's Venona, which was contemporary. I'll come to Vasiliev in a minute, because of course I've absorbed Vasiliev in all the other books. But Vasiliev is fifth hand. Vasiliev is a KGB defector who now lives in this country. He was allowed into the KGB archives. He was not allowed to photocopy, so he took notes. And his information has been transliterated, deciphered, transcribed, and translated. So it comes to us fifth hand. He doesn't say much more. His most damning comment is that Ethel acted as a lookout. I think it's unverifiable. It would certainly not be acceptable evidence in a court. But while the KGB archives are closed, nobody can confirm it. But if you do want to take Vasiliev's information, what he also says is that Julius was out of the loop at that point. So Julius, who'd been laid off by the KGB because they thought he was hot, was very definitely not passing atomic secrets. It was military and industrial information. And I think it's widely accepted that the important atomic information came from Klaus Fuchs. So the disparity between the sentencing is really bizarre. But Lawrence asks, why would Ethel not be involved? The reason Ethel would not be involved is, first of all, because I don't think communism was her main focus. I think it was trying to look after these children. Michael was a difficult child. She had no family help. She had scoliosis and a bad back. And she was actually seeking therapy to help with looking after her children. So looking after her children was really the focus of her life, and I think she would recognize that if they were, or it's possible that she would recognize that if they were both arrested, the children would not have parents. So that's motive as to why she wouldn't be involved. She didn't have anything to add to the information, but most important of all, it's not a crime to think. It's not a crime to know. It was not even a crime at that point to report your husband. What you had to, in order to commit a crime, you had to commit an overt act, willingly to destroy information or to stop the authorities knowing. So they knew perfectly well that there was not evidence against Ethel. And in fact, Hoover at the end did not want to see her electrocuted. And the Deputy Attorney General said about Ethel, she called our bluff. So to say there is evidence and it's widely accepted, I don't think there is, because it's widely disputed. And I'm not saying that Ethel was not a communist, and I'm not saying that Ethel was not sympathetic to her husband, to Julius, and to what he was doing. I'm sure she knew, but there could have been a custodial sentence. The only reason that they killed her was because they got themselves on the hook. They charged her effectively with treason. I mean, she wasn't charged with treason, but that was another aspect of the mistrial, because the judge kept using the word treason. Treason was not applicable because what the alleged secrets were passed when Russia was an ally. But more to the point, the charge of treason would have required two witnesses to any overt act, and there were never two witnesses. So, the judge was accusing them of treason, which was wildly out of touch with what was acceptable in conspiracy to commit espionage. So, I think we probably will have to agree to differ as to whether the evidence is actually proof as to what Ethel was doing, and certainly whether Ethel was supportive. Is that a crime?
If I can just come back, we're not disagreeing that she shouldn't have been executed, or that a reasonable sentence in those circumstances would have been quite a short one. There's no disagreement about that, or that her role at most was supportive. But I think it's important not to. I mean, these documents, the Vassiliev documents, have been gone through by some of the best Cold War historians at the Woodrow Wilson Center very carefully. I mean, they're not fabrications. A lot of the information within them has been corroborated, not just to do with the Rosenberg. So I think it's important not to dismiss them. Secondly, I don't think we're disagreeing on the issue of whether she should be executed, but it does seem to me that she had a pretty good idea what was going on. And, if the Venona documents had been admissible evidence at the time, which was up to the government, they obviously weren't going to reveal their sources, then the case would have looked even more damning on Julius. One of the questions, to move the discussion on just simply from the issue of whether or not she bears some guilt for what went on, is given that we now know that Julius was guilty of being part of aspiring, what was in his mind? Because both of them are protesting their innocence, and they sort of went up or went down together, and that was moving in its own way in terms of the strength of their marriage. If it was the case that Ethel had no role in it, why didn't Julius confess? Because if he had done, then he probably wouldn't have been executed, and his wife wouldn't have been executed as well. Why do you think he didn't confess?
Well, I think there is a case to be made against Julius for not trying to save his wife, but he wasn't asked simply to confess. He was asked to name names, and there are because he recruited from among his friends, he wasn't prepared to name names. But I think you can criticize Julius, but I'm not sure they had a lot of room for maneuver. And the only issue I would take is I'm quite sure Ethel knew, but I think there's a huge difference between knowing what was going on and, as you say, taking part in it. Can you not hear? Oh.
I can hear. I'm not sure there is such a huge difference. I mean, I think this is a serious business he was engaged in, very serious business, and it's not, it's not a minor thing. I think if you're engaged in deception, if you're a spy, you have to protect yourself. You're having meetings. I just think it's very difficult to detach yourself from that, to say, well, it was a thing my husband did, but it wasn't really something for me.
Well, I'm absolutely at no point defending the imparting of information to another country by one individual. Nobody is trying to justify that. Of course, it's not within an individual's remit to decide what you can give just because you think that the Russians are allies and friends. I'm not taking that line. I'm simply saying that I don't think you can assume that the wife is automatically guilty at the same level. I don't think.
nor would I say she's guilty at the same level, but she's engaged, she's involved. It's more than just being aware. And Julius is clearly the more important figure in the spiral, isn't it? I mean, that's not an issue.
What was the question? Was she in the spiring? Well, I don't think she was in the spiring.
I'm saying that Julius was clearly the most important. I'm not disputing that. We're not disagreeing on a lot, other than the interpretation of what it means to know that your husband is a spy, and to, in a sense, unavoidably be part of the deception that comes with being a spy.
Yes, I'm not minimising it. I can only come back to my other comment that if this is about one thing, it's about the importance of the rule of law. And the rule of law demands that an individual has a right to a fair trial and a separate trial. And knowing and thinking was not a crime.
Well, there's two different issues there. Was this a good trial? Obviously not. It was a terrible trial. And also, as you point out very clearly in the book, all sorts of things that would deserve at most a retrial and maybe even squashed because of the way it was done. It was not, the rule of law in that sense was not followed. If it had been followed, and if some of the evidence that later became available was available then, might the same conclusion have been reached, if not quite the same sentence, but possibly it would have been. I think, so the rule of law, it's a very vivid part of the story. And another interesting question is why she, which you give reasons, why she got such bad legal advice, which is another big part of the problem. If one thinks of the show trials of recent years, when top lawyers have gone in to defend unlikely characters and have done rather well by them. This certainly didn't happen in this case. So, in that sense, the rule of law was not followed. But that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't something there.
Are there any questions from the floor at that point? Yes, Ella.
Sorry, can you take your mask off to ask?
What happened to the children?
Michael and Robbie were 10 and 6 when their parents were killed, and the lawyer, who can be criticised, he was doing his best but was out of his depth and no one else would take on the case, wanted to adopt them, but he had a heart attack at 51, almost a few months after the case. So the New York State wanted to institutionalize them. They were really worried that they would become a thorn in the side of the administration forever after. But the Mirapols, this couple that I just showed you the picture, stepped forward and they had to go through a rigorous process. It took about 3 years, but eventually they adopted them. So they took the name Mirapol. They're still alive. They're retired college professors in their 70s, and they've remained loyal to their parents in that they thought until Venona that Julius was innocent. They now fully accept that Julius was a spy ring recruiter, and Ethel, they believe, should be exonerated, but.
By other children?
Yes, they were for a bit.
Yeah. Okay. It is on, yes. I wanted to ask if you have, in your researching and your interviewing the people involved in the prosecution, whether they have expressed remorse at what either they did or what others did. And I know there was an appeal at one time which was rejected. Is there any chance of getting some form of official statement from the Americans that there was a miscarriage of justice?
I think they're hoping that because Joe Biden is against capital punishment, he might. But I would think it's not something that politician would see as enhancing his career to take on. It's still a very divisive subject. For the reasons you've heard Lawrence describe. I mean, I at no point say that the threat from communism was credible. I mean, after Russia exploded a bomb in '49, and then China turned communist, and then the Korean War, there was a real fear that the world, communism was going to become a global threat, and having won World War II, they were in danger of losing the peace, and everything that America had fought would be lost. So, this was a real issue, and spies had to be taught a lesson. That's really very clear and not an issue. So those issues are still very live in America. I would be surprised if any politician decides to overturn it.
Yes, sir.
You've said that the complete mistrial was a mixture of anti-Semitism, misogyny, and legal cock-up, if you want to put it that way. How would you divide up those three aspects?
Thank you. I'd love to talk more about anti-Semitism. I thought Lawrence and I would, but I will now. Anti-Semitism was not the reason they were arrested. They were arrested through a clear sequence of events, as I showed, Venona leading to Klaus Fuchs. Anti-Semitism did not notably increase as a result of their electrocution. The trial was full of Jews. The courtroom was almost all Jewish. The prosecutor, the defense, the defendants, the judge, but not the jury. So why was nobody on the jury in New York Jewish? And that's mostly because prospective jurors who were Jewish excused themselves. They did not want to be part of this trial. So the Jewish community was divided, of that there's no question. And so it's hard to pin down, well, where was the anti-Semitism in all of this? But it clearly was there. So I usually resort to Arthur Miller, whose play The Crucible appeared in 1953, which he said was not specifically about the Rosenbergs, it was about the atmosphere of fear and McCarthyism. And he said, you can't say that anti-Semitism was not part of this trial. Put it in context. It was 5 years after the war when 6 million Jews had burned, and here were 2 more Jews who were being burnt. You cannot see that in isolation without saying that anti-Semitism played a part in it. But I can't pin down precisely where it was, except that you could say that people like Roy Cohn and Irving Kaufman fought to be in charge of showing that they're a different sort of Jew, and we are not part of it. So you could argue that that is anti-Semitism of a sort. So it was present. And otherwise, what precise role misogyny played? Well, certainly in the judge's summing up, he said Ethel, because she was older, was obviously a full-fledged partner in the crime. There is no evidence, I would argue, that she was a full-fledged partner in the crime just because she knew about it and did not report her husband. So, it's hard to isolate it, but of course it was there. And what was the third element, anti-communism and?
Well, the legal mess-up. Yes.
Oh, the legal mess-up. Well, Manny Block thought it was going to be a trial about being a communist, so Ethel was persuaded to take the Fifth Amendment. That was very bad advice. So she didn't answer the questions, and on many occasions, people thought that the jury concluded she was slippery, she can't be trusted, she didn't show emotion, she didn't cry, she didn't break down. Well, it was certainly not... Kaufman the judge intervened. He took advice. He took consultation from the prosecutor, which is not allowed either. There were various legal missteps.
But even if there wasn't direct anti-Semitism, the atmosphere of the country, did that contribute to general anti-Semitic feeling and possibly the need for the lawyers that you mentioned taking having the attitude that they had?
I think it's very hard to say it was anti-Semitism. It was real, genuine, existential, credible fear of the communist threat. The fact that a lot of Jews were communists, of course, is true, but that doesn't make it anti-Semitism. Yeah.
You mentioned misogyny, but when you were talking about it, you highlighted the fact that Ethel was older by 3 years and therefore was held to be the one responsible. In what sense would that be misogynistic, just because she's 3 years older?
Because it was considered deviant somehow for an older woman, and because she was, there was a man called Morris Ernst who was a Jewish lawyer, part of the civil rights organization, who tried very hard to intervene in the case, and he tried to prove that because she was older, she was the ringleader, she was taking the lead, and he had a long correspondence trying to get various people involved, particularly Eleanor Roosevelt, because it was known she was against the death penalty, trying to show that he understood what motivated Ethel and Julius, and that Ethel was the master and Julius her slave, and that language creeps into Roy Cohn's language, and ultimately in Eisenhower saying the reason he couldn't give clemency was because she was the master, and that's how that developed.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm not entirely convinced that that's misogyny, but your explanation...
No, it's not alone, but there was an idea that a woman at that point should just be a housewife and stay at home, and that Ethel had somehow stepped out of her box, that she was the one, she was the clever one, which everybody knew, and she was the one who had led him astray. She was the more avid communist. It's not misogyny on its own, but it's part of the atmosphere that she was really the more wicked one in some ways, because they had a harder case to prove against her.
Going back to the adoptive parents, the Mirapols, were they Jewish, and did they know the Rosenbergs?
They were Jewish, and they did not know the Rosenbergs. They'd had 3 stillbirths and wanted children, and they were introduced by a mutual friend, but no, they hadn't known the Rosenbergs.
I apologise for a slightly legal question, but what is the legal test for conspiring to commit espionage, and what, in your view, are the elements where Ethel did commit, under those rules, espionage? Or conspiracy.
Well, it's known from Venona. They say she knows about Julius's work. I really don't think there is any doubt, and I wouldn't want to cast doubt on that. So, as part of a conspiracy, she knew and was aware of what he was doing. Well, that may be. I think the jury had to be convinced that there was a conspiracy. But no, the test was to provide an overt act that she'd been part of the conspiracy. And the overt act that they produced was that she typed up the notes. But when David came out of prison, he said, I don't remember who typed up the notes. Probably nobody did, and maybe my wife did. So we know that that was perjury, but that was the overt act that proved a conspiracy. And in answer to your question about remorse, the only person who spoke subsequently was David when he came out of prison, and he was specifically asked, do you have any remorse? And he said, no, my sister was stupid. She should have named names and confessed. It was entirely my sister's stupidity, and I sleep very easily at night, and I don't have remorse.
Louise.
I've just read Agent Sonia, Ben McIntyre, I think, and he just thinking about the role of women and the assumption that a woman with children couldn't possibly be a spy, because of course Agent Sonia, in conjunction with Fuchs, was one of the most active people and living in this I mean, she came from Germany, didn't she? But she was living in Oxfordshire with her 3 children, making bread and cakes and going to the Women's Institute meetings. And as a result of that fact, nobody took seriously the possibility that she could be a spy.
Yeah.
So that was going on, not just, you know, well, going on all over the place, clearly.
I think it's an absolutely...
Millicent Baggott, you know, who went to Putney High School. I don't know if anyone knows about Millicent Baggott. But anyway, Millicent Baggott, who was working for MI5 or MI6, was convinced that she was a spy, but even though she was very senior within the service, nobody took her assertions about Agent Sonia seriously either. So it can be confusing women.
No, it's a wonderful book and an extraordinary story, and I absolutely agree with you, but I think it shows a huge contrast. I mean, she was actively involved in passing messages and dead drops and getting information and moving on, and it's gripping, but different. Sorry, I've had my back to you, but
I wonder if I'm just curious to know whether the communist witch hunts that followed were they because of this case, or would they have happened anyway?
Are you talking about in America?
Yes.
Well, it was at this time. I mean, McCarthy actually overreached himself. Ethel was electrocuted in 1953, and in 1954, McCarthy decided to take on the army and say they too were riddled with communists. But he overreached himself there, and he was finished in 54. So, no, the communist witch hunts and Hollywood were very much part of this.
Thank you, Anne. I think it's difficult to assess the rules of law in terms of as we are today, because if you consider the febrile atmosphere which occurred during the McCarthy period and leading up to it, there are numerous cases of prosecution of Hollywood personalities and so on, in which if the cases had been retried today, they would have been thrown out in all kinds of ways. So you know, when you talk about what are the rules by which you would govern a prosecution, by which you would govern whether somebody is guilty or innocent, you cannot begin to consider how it is today. But what I was going to say also, I'm trying to distinguish between what Laurie was saying and what your book is saying, because you talked about conspiracy. Laurie is suggesting that the questions about her guilt. I think your book is as much as anything about the fact that the rule of law had not been complied with, that it was a complete miscarriage of justice, that everybody participating in the trial itself had their own agenda, if you like. So, you know, from my perception, that was the fascinating part of the book, the way that the rule of law in America was perverted at that particular time.
Thank you. I don't think you want an answer.
Can I just pop in on that, if I may? I think that the point about the a lot of the McCarthyism is it wasn't carried out through trials. I mean, there were a few, and we're talking about them, espionage, but by and large, when they were called witch hunts, it was pushing people out of their jobs in government and in Hollywood. That's why the Fifth Amendment issue was so important. You don't want to incriminate yourself. So you see all the McCarthy hearings, you have these people hauled up before the House of Un-American Activities and pleading the Fifth Amendment, and that was taken as a presumption of guilt. And it didn't really matter. It wasn't about the rule of law in that sense. They would be punished by not getting jobs with the major movie companies and so on. And I think Anne mentioned the bad advice that they were given to take the Fifth Amendment on the assumption this was about really showing whether they were communists or not, which again they clearly were or had been. So I think the rule of law clearly was messed up terribly in the trial itself. But you're talking about something much broader in terms of the atmosphere of the early 50s. Of which this, in a way, was a culmination. This is, as Anne pointed out, when McCarthy took on the army, when you have a general as president, it's not a good idea. It was coming to an end at this point. People calmed down by the mid-50s. But although the effects of the blacklist lasted much longer. But it is separate. I think the trials were few and far between.
Thank you, Lawrence. Can I ask Judy if she can propose a vote of thanks?
Thank you. It's really been an absolutely fascinating evening, so thank you so much for coming and giving us so much of your time and insight and answering all of our questions, or most of them, and raising the fascinating possibility that a big miscarriage of justice was carried out, almost a show trial. Absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for being here in person and allowing us all to be here in person, which is a real treat. And thank you, Lawrence, also for being on screen. And thank you, everybody, for participating. I apologise, we've had a few technical hiccups. It's actually quite a complex operation.
Yes.
But thank you, everybody, for bearing with us. And thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say a couple of thank yous for the home team. First of all, Ricky and Sharon. As Judy says, it's been a very complicated business, combining a presentation, Anne in the synagogue, and Lawrence streaming. But apart from one or two hitches, I think it did go well. Judy, as usual, for manning the door and getting here early. Paula, my fellow committee member, who's always, these events could not happen without her. Now we're going to have some light refreshments. Anne is going to sign some books. You've got the choice between a dedication and signing, or just signing. It's up to you to let her know. And thank you, as Judy says, to everybody for being here. And to the new faces, we hope we'll see you. We hope we'll see you again soon. Thank you.